Okay, that's hi, Stephen. Not sure if you responded, but you're on mute. Let's just share the text on the screen, and we'll be ready to start on time. Everyone. Double check, I think. Hi,
Hello,
David.
Rabbi.
How are
Hello.
you?
Fine, thank you.
Good, thank
Hello,
you.
David. Hello, John.
Hello.
Okay, so I think the last time that we studied together was even before Rosh Hashanah, because we then had all the Chagim that kind of pretty much fell out on Wednesdays. And then last week I was away, unfortunately, and wasn't able to connect. So it's good to be back. And I hope everyone's been keeping up with the learning. We're in a new chapter, or recently into a new area of law. And today's chapter is contingent on the theme, but actually intersects with a bunch of other laws, some that we've learned previously and some that we are yet to learn. So we're going to touch on particularly laws of purity and impurity, which is its whole own section of halachic consideration. But we're going to learn how that affects the laws that we're dealing with over here as it pertains to who can be within the temple complex and to what degree, and when one would have to remove themselves or be removed. Okay, so let's begin today's chapter. We'll start with halacha 1. He says, mitzvah ta'aseh l'shalech kol atmei min hamikdash. It's a positive mitzvah to send all impure persons away from the temple. Again, the laws of purity and impurity in and of themselves are complex. We're just going to get a taste of it today as they pertain to this matter of being within the temple complex. Impurity is a spiritual state of being, and therefore somewhat elusive in getting a very tangible understanding of it. But we will see that there are different levels of impurity, and dependent on the levels of impurity, that will determine how far away one would have to be removed from the temple, and also what degree of punishment one would be liable for if they were to transgress that imperative to be off the temple mount. Okay, so he says this is based on the verse, right? The mitzvah to remove someone who's impure from the temple mount, as the pasuk says, "Vayishalchu min hamachane kol tzarua v'chol zov v'chol tamei lanefesh." So the verse says, "You shall send away from the camp." We'll see what that camp is exactly. All those with tzaraat. Tzaraat is what we commonly translate as leprosy, but we know it was a physical manifestation of a spiritual disease, and one who contracted tzaraat would be ritually impure. A zav is a man who has an unnatural seminal emission, and that would make such a person impure, and similarly contact with a dead body. So for all these three, the verse says generally they need to be removed from the camp. So now we're going to analyze this. The camp cited refers to the camp of the divine presence, meaning from the entrance of the courtyard of the Israelites onwards. Basically, in the times in the desert times, so the way in which the Jews encamped was that the outer encampment was all the tribes. We call that the Israelite camp. Somewhat more inward was where the Levium could be, and then within that was the Mishkan, which was called the camp of the divine presence. In the times of the temple, so the camp of the divine presence is from the entrance to the courtyard. We learned the laws of the Biat Hamikdash, the construction of the temple, right? So from within the temple, that's considered the Machane Shechina, the camp of the divine presence. From the entrance to the temple mount until that point is considered Machane Levia, the Levite camp, and from the entrance of Jerusalem until the entrance to the temple mount, that is called the Israelite camp. So that's how it was manifest in Jerusalem in the times of the temple. So he says when you remove them from the camp, where do they go to? Okay? So should one infer that a person with Sarat or Zav ailments and one impure due to contact with a corpse are all three sent to the same place? Is that what we're saying? Because we say each is removed, does that mean they get moved to the same place? So I'll clarify that that's not the case. With regard to one inflicted with Sarat, as the pasuk says in Vayikra, Badad Yeshev Mechus Machanem Shava. He shall abide alone outside the camp where he dwells. Therefore, the camp from which he is sent refers to the camp of the Israelites, which parallels the area from the entrance to Jerusalem and beyond. Because when it says that he's got to dwell alone, that means he's outside of Jerusalem. From this, we conclude, just like a person who is afflicted with Sarat, because his impurity is more severe, he is sent away in a more severe manner than others. So to any individuals whose state of impurity is more severe than others should be sent out in a more severe manner. So what we're going to see is the distance that one is sent is going to depend on the severity of the impurity. And we know that Sarat is considered the most severe of impurities, and that's why he's sent the furthest away, even outside of Jerusalem, outside what we call the camp of Israel. Therefore, a person afflicted with Sarat is sent outside of all three camps, meaning outside of Jerusalem. That means he's not in the temple complex, he's not even on the Temple Mount, he's not even in Jerusalem, he's beyond that. Because and how do we know that Sarat is the most severe type of impurity? Because most of us are probably familiar that we would usually refer to the contact with a dead body in a certain sense as the most severe. But in this context, Sarat is considered the most severe. Why? Because he causes a house to become considered impure when he enters it. Because he can spread his impurity just by being within a building, unlike some of the other impurities that we discussed, it's the most severe. He has to be the furthest away. This would not apply with regard to a Zav. A Zav will only transfer his impurity through touching or so on, not just by being in the same building. Again, these are laws we'll unpack further in the laws of purity and impurity. But basically, what we'll get a taste of is that you have levels of impurity and you also have modes of transferring that impurity. So sometimes something can be have a high level of impurity, but might not transfer in the same way. And for different things would then be considered less severe. So in our discussion, the Metzora is the most severe and is therefore sent the furthest out. The Zav, however, and here we're going to show the Zav is categorized with numerous other individuals who have the same level of impurity. Okay, so men with a Zav condition, women with a Zava condition. We mentioned that Zav is someone who has an unnatural seminal emission. Zava is a woman who has who bleeds not at her regular time of the month. Nidot is a woman during her regular cycle of Nida, or a woman who's given birth. So all of those until they attain a level of ritual purity are sent outside two camps, meaning they need to be off the Temple Mount. The two camps again would then be the Temple complex, the Temple Mount, but they can be within Jerusalem. The rationale for the severity is that they cause an entity upon which they are seated upon, which they are lying, to become ritually impure, even if it is under a stone. Because these people can transfer impurity layers down under them. You know, there's even something that they don't touch directly, but they sat above, they would deem it to be rich and impure. That is considered a severe level of impurity because of the way it can be transferred. And therefore, they have to go out at least of these two camps. And this does not apply with regard to impurity contracted from a corpse. You'd have to have direct contact with the corpse in order for that impurity to afflict an individual, even though on a certain sense, the corpse is considered the highest level of impurity. Okay, halacha 4. A person who is impure because of contact with a human corpse, and even a corpse itself, as the actual corpse, is permitted to enter the Temple Mount. This we learn from the verse, and Moshe took the bones of Joseph with him. Remember, Joseph died, made his brothers' children promise that they would take him out of Egypt with them. And when they left Egypt, where were those bones kept? It says that Moshe kept them with him, which implies in the camp of the Levites, because Moshe is a Levite, he kept it with him in his home. So even the corpse of someone who comes in contact with a corpse can remain there. Now, he's going to talk about other types of impurity and different demarcations. The three general demarcations that we spoke of now: the temple complex, from the entrance of the temple itself. Sorry, let's call it broadly: the temple complex, the Temple Mount, and then Jerusalem. So Machane Shechina, Machane Levia, Machane Israel. Those are all biblical demarcations. In the coming halachot, what we're going to see is that the rabbis subdivided it somewhat for different considerations. So from the chel, you remember the chel is that low wall that was around the Biat Hamikdash walls itself. So he says from the chel, Gentiles, or those who contracted impurity from a human corpse, and those who had relations with the nida are sent away. A person who immersed that day may enter, therefore is already immersed. What he's talking about over here is when it comes to the laws of purity and impurity, we know that a primary way of alleviating ritual impurity is to go to the mikveh. But the way it works biblically is that any person who's required to go to the mikveh also has to wait out the day until sunset in order for the ritual purity to be achieved. So somebody who's gone to, it's called the Tvul Yom. Tvul means they've gone to the mikveh, but they're not yet waited out their day. So he says here, someone who's gone to mikveh, even though they haven't waited out their day, they can move beyond the chel. We'll see that they cannot move beyond the actual entrance to the temple, but they can move beyond the chel. Because remember, biblically, this is all still part of the Machane Leviah. It's not actually yet the Machane Shechina. This is an additional demarcation by the rabbis. From the woman's courtyard, one who immersed himself that day is sent away, but not one who has not completed the purification process. So again, we subdividing it further from the woman's courtyard, which is the external part of the compound, not yet the Machane Shechina. So he says, so you would have sometimes someone who's impure. So the process would be they have to go to mikveh, they have to wait out the day till sunset, and then there should also be, sometimes there would be sacrifices that one had to bring. That's called Mechusar Kippurim. If they've gone to mikveh, the sun has set, but they have not yet brought their korban, not yet brought their sacrificial offering required, they are Mechusar Kippurim. So that's another level of impurity. And here we say they can go to the woman's courtyard, but not beyond that. For the day on which a person has not completed the purification process, immersed himself, for the day on which a person who has not completed the purification process, immersed himself, has already passed. So his sun is set, so he's achieved a high level. The only thing that's missing now is that he hasn't brought his korban. He can go a little bit further. The prohibition against a person who has immersed himself entering this portion of the camp of the Levites is rabbinic in origin. In fact, as is true with the previous three halachot that we spoke about, those additional demarcations for those particular individuals. Now, Me'ezrus Yisrael v'nifnim. Now we're really getting a little bit close in, right? This is even one who has not completed his process of purification should not enter, because his process of purification is not yet consummated. This is again the Mechusar Kippurim. If he has not yet brought his korban, he cannot go now beyond what we call now the Ezrat Yisrael. Where do we learn this from? We learn this from the pasuk that is spoken of with regard to a woman who's seeking purification after childbirth. And the verse says, and the priest will bring atonement for her and she will become pure. What is the priest bringing atonement for her referred to? The bringing of the sacrifice. Therefore, one can infer that until then she was not pure. And then anybody in that same category, the ones that we listed in the previous halakha, the zava, and so on and so forth, or anybody who has to bring korban, in addition to going through the mikveh and waiting out the day, the same law would apply. Halacha ches 8. An impure person who must be sent away from the Temple Mount violates a negative commandment if he entered there. Right? He has to go away. What if he knew he was impure and he walked into the Temple Mount? Well, that's a violation. And this, there's not just, we began the chat by saying it's a positive mitzvah to send such a person away. Now we're saying the individual themselves, if they were to enter, violate a negative prohibitions. It's a separate mitzvah. As the pasuk says, and he shall go outside the camp. This refers to the camp of Shechina, and he shall not enter the midst of the camp. This refers to the camp of the Levites. Similarly, a person afflicted by tzaras who enters Jerusalem is liable for lashes. Right? So each one, if they enter into the particular camp, the outermost camp that they were not allowed to be in, would transgress a prohibition. Similarly, a person afflicted by tzarat, so listen to this, a person who afflicted by tzarat who enters Jerusalem is liable for lashes. If he enters any of the other walled cities, there's something else, although he is not allowed to, as implied by the verse, he should abide alone, he's not liable for lashes. And we're going to, so it's specific Jerusalem he's not going into, even though he's meant to remain alone, but he only transgresses the negative, he only violates the negative command if he goes into Jerusalem. Now, here's an interesting thing. Halacha 9. If one afflicted with tzaras enters the Temple Mount, he's liable for 80 lashes. That means why? Because it's a double prohibition. Because he should have been out of Jerusalem and out of the camp of the Levites. And once he goes into the Temple Mount, he's now traversed both of those. And as he traversed both of those, he transgresses one prohibition and then another prohibition. And for each one, there's a separate set of lashes. If ever one who is impure because of contact with a human corpse, or one who immersed himself that day entered the woman's courtyard, remember, or one who has not completed his process of purification enters the Israelite courtyard. In other words, they've gone only one step beyond where they were out. He's not given lashes. He is ever given stripes for rebellious conduct. Sorry, if you go into an area where biblically you're not liable, but where the rabbi said you're not allowed to enter beyond, so there's no biblical lashes because you haven't transgressed the biblical negative command. However, being as we've just learned in the previous few halachot about the rabbinic injunctions with regard to these places, the rabbis would be permitted to administer what we call makas mardos, the rabbinic lashes. Halacha 10, just as there's a positive command to send impure person out from the temple, so too, if they enter, they violate a negative commandment. Okay, this is following on from what we said. As it says in Numbers, they shall not make your camp impure. This refers to the camp of the Shekhinah. What source teaches that one does not violate the prohibition? I guess he enters the temple, but then he's exempt if he touches the temple courtyard from the outside. And this is interesting because the point of view is that this is something you shouldn't do, but you wouldn't be liable. Whereas you can't touch you're not allowed to enter the temple, then you would be transgressing a negative command. But if you touched it, it's not something you should do, but you wouldn't be violating the transgression. Again, it's come back to verses that describe the pregnant woman or the woman after childbirth. It says there, she shall not enter the sanctuary. The emphasis on lo tavo, not enter, tells you that you wouldn't transgress just by touching. Now, what are the consequences of entering? So we've spoken about lashes. He says like this: when for the other prohibitions, when an impure person willfully enters the temple, he is punishable by karet. Karet is what it literally means to cut off. It's the soul's excision. It's something that happens from heaven, which is considered a very severe consequence. Okay, so he's punishable by karet, as the pasuk says. If he will not clean his garments or wash his flesh, he will bear his iniquity. If he enters, that's what a karet is defined by this expression. Now, what if he enters unknowingly? He went in, he didn't know he was tameh, or he didn't know where he was going, right? He is liable for an adjustable guilt offering. So he brings a korban, and through that he finds atonement. So we call a korban oila v'yored, meaning there's the specifications of what exactly is brought is dependent on particular circumstance. It can change. It's not like a standard korban. And as the verse says, or a soul that will touch any impure entity. One is liable for karet or a sacrifice only when one enters from Israelite courtyard or onward, or into an addition to the courtyard that was sanctified in a consummate manner, as we explained, right? When we learned about the laws of the building of the Biat Hamikdash, we learned that you can expand that area. In other words, karet is not if you came into those areas that the rabbis already applied further restriction, like the Ezrat Nashim and beyond the Chel. Only if you actually came into the Israelite courtyard. Halacha 13. What are the types of impurity for which one is liable for entering the temple while impure? So he says, anyone who became impure through contact with a human corpse in a manner which would, in other words, we said impurity, but how did you contract that impurity is also important, right? We've spoken about levels of impurity. We've inferred how one might transfer impurity and how that dictates the severity of your impurity. And now we can ask, what about how did you actually come to that impurity? So he says, anyone who became impure through the contact with a human corpse in a manner which would require a Nazirite to shave his head because of them, these are explained in Hilchot Nazirut. If you'll remember in the laws of Nazirut, so a Nazir is not allowed to come into contact with a corpse. He's also not allowed to cut his hair. So although if he comes in contact with a corpse, now if he comes into contact with a corpse, he would have to end his Nazirut, he'd have to cut his hair and start over again. So you have to be certain that the transfer of impurity is absolute. So we discussed there that indirect contact would be impure, but not the level of impurity that would require him to cut his hair. And it's the same thing over here. The person who's restricted from coming to the temple mount is someone who's came into contact with a dead body in the way that the Nazirite would have to start his process all over and cut his hair. That's one. Two, one who touched a person or utensil that became impure through those types of impurity for which a Nazirite must shave his head. For such a person is considered as a second level of impurity to a primary object of impurity that touched a corpse. Again, the point is over here that we know that the impurity is now transferred by means of a biblical definition, not just a rabbinic definition. And C, one who became impure through contact with another primary source of impurity as mandated by scriptural law. As we explained in the appropriate places, the key really is, again, that the impurity was transferred in a way as defined by Torah, as opposed to as defined by rabbinic law as additional kind of protection against the law. The general principle is, anyone who is required to immerse himself in water according to scriptural law is liable for karet for entering the temple while impure, even after he immersed himself until nightfall of that day, right? Because until nightfall, the process isn't finished. If ever one became pure due to impurity stemming from a human corpse that does not require a Nazarite to shave his head, then he's exempt from entering the temple, even though his impurity lasts for 7 days, which means to say he shouldn't be there, but he's not liable for the karet because he's not transgressing the biblical prohibition. So it's what we call patur avol asur. He's exempt from the punishment, but it's still something that is prohibited. Okay, and in certain cases, certain similar cases, we know then the rabbis can actually apply their own punishment. Similarly, if one touches utensils that touched a human corpse or touches a person who is touching utensils that touch a corpse, so this is something that is discussed again in the laws of impurity, even though he is considered as impure to the first degree with regard to teruma and with regard to imparting impurity to sacrificial foods, he is exempt from entering the temple. And so what we're getting a taste of over here is that when it comes to laws of impurity, there are, as we said, levels of impurity. There are ways in which one contracts impurity. There are ways in which one transfers that impurity. And part of what will dictate how transferable impurity is also the sensitivity of the object that is being pure. Something that is higher level sanctity will be more susceptible to impurity. More susceptible, but it won't necessarily gain the same degree of impurity. Okay, these are things which we'll get clarity on in the laws of Tumah and Tara. Now, for these matters, are laws received through oral tradition. Although he is exempt, he is given stripes for rebellious conduct. Right, that's the point that I made in the previous halacha. Because it's not explicit in the Torah, as he says, but it's something that's drawn from oral tradition. So it's rabbinic. It's not the biblical prohibition, but the rabbis would have and can apply their own punishment, which would be what we call the makas mardut. 16, a person who brings a dead teeming animal or the like into the temple, or when he brings an impure person into the temple, he is liable for karet because he made God's sanctity impure. In other words, even if he brought it in a way that he doesn't have contact, so he's not impure, but he's bringing the impurity into the sanctity. If ever he threw impure utensils in the temple, even if there were utensils that touch a corpse, he is exempt from karet, but liable for lashes, as implied again by the proof test cited above. If he will not clean his garments, that if a person came in, meaning it's not just him, but even his garments that he brings in, he would be transgressing a prohibition. So if you threw something impure in, even though you're not going in, but there is still a biblical prohibition. And according to our tradition, for entering the temple without washing his body, he's liable for karet. For entering without cleaning his garments, he receives lashes. And so if you threw something in, it would be the same as walking in with clothing that's impure. Halacha 17. It appears to me, so this is the Rambam's own deduction, it's not explicitly said elsewhere, that he is liable for lashes only for his clothes that are a source of ritual impurity, meaning clothes that were touched by a person who became impure through contact with a corpse that themselves became a source of ritual impurity, as will be explained. In other words, some things can become impure, but won't necessarily transfer that impurity. Details to be discussed later, right? So the Rambam is saying this that we said you would get lashes is only for that type of impurity, something that can actually, in and of itself, then transfer impurity beyond itself. If by contrast one brings a garment which is of the first degree impurity in the temple, he's not liable for lashes. He does ever receive stripes for rebellious conduct. Again, the rabbis will apply their punishment here. 18. Similarly, when an impure person inserts his hand alone into the temple, so he's impure, he doesn't walk into the base of Hamikdash, but he sticks his hand in. He is given stripes for rebellious conduct because he hasn't transgressed the mitzvah, but again, clearly not good behavior. Similarly, one who purposely enters the temple before immersing himself while he is impure because of contact with objects that are a source of ritual impurity by virtue of rabbinic decree. Again, something that he's not liable for kares or lashes because he ate impure foods, for example, or because he drank impure beverages. Such a person, again, it's bad behavior. The rabbis would apply this makas mardut. Halacha 19, when an impure person enters the temple through the rooftops, he is exempt. Interesting, right? So if he jumps over rooftops to get in, he's not liable for the biblical transgression. This is derived from the proof text. Again, he says he shall not enter the temple. It implies that the Torah is liable only when he entered in the way that is usually entered. Although he is exempt from Koros, he is given lashes for rebellious conduct. This exemption applies even if he enters in a compartment flying in the air. Imagine the Rambam perceived of an airplane. Or I don't know what else he was thinking of when he spoke about a compartment flying in the air. Okay, but if somehow you were airdropped into the temple, it's the same thing. You haven't transgressed the biblical prohibition, but you are liable for this rebellious conduct. Whether you enter the temple in this compartment through the roofs or through the entrance. Okay, so if you came in a drone and you got through the entrance, you didn't walk through. It's not the normal way of entering. You misbehaving, but you haven't transgressed the biblical command. Halacha 20. In all places where one is liable for karet, for a willful transgression, or a sacrifice of an unknowing transgression, should an impure object be found there on the Shabbos, it should be removed. So here's the thing, right? Something that's impure has no use. Therefore, it's muktzah on Shabbos. But now if it's found in a place where you would be liable for entering as an individual that was impure, that object must be removed from that area on Shabbos. In other places, it should be covered with the utensil until after the Shabbos. Now, when it is removed, interesting, when a Kohen is required, and this has ramifications in other laws as well, when a Kohen is required to remove something that's impure from the temple complex, so what does he have to do? He should remove it only with a flat wooden utensil. Why? Because a flat wooden utensil is not itself susceptible to contracting ritual impurity. Because although he has to get it off the temple mount, he should not, in the process, cause something else to become impure. So he shouldn't take it in his clothes or in a utensil, but you want to just take it out with something that is not susceptible to impurity. So there should not be an increase in ritual impurity. Okay. Now, both an impure person enter the temple when he is pure, and a pure person enter the temple when there was impurity in it. For example, a corpse is lying under the shelter in the temple, and he entered under the shelter. So if he enters and becomes tameh at the same point, he's liable for karet. In the latter situations, interest and impurity occur at one time. Same thing. But because he's entering with impurity, this is the transgression. This is what he's liable for. If one enters the temple and becomes impure thereafter he enters, even if he purposely made himself impure, he should hurry and depart in the shortest way possible. Because he didn't enter impure. Again, remember, there was an emphasis that the transgression is entering impure. But if somehow he contracted tumah while he was there, even if it's intentionally, he's not liable for that particular transgression, but he's obligated to get off, listen carefully, the shortest way possible. Okay? And he said, the Rambam elaborates, it's forbidden for him to tarry, to bow, or to depart via a longer way. And remember, this would have been something, usually a person doesn't rush out of the Temple Mount. You might take the longer route out, and you may bow in deference, walk out backwards, slowly. That you can't do if you evacuating because you're originally impure. If he tarried or departed via a longer way, even though he did not tarry, so let's say he went a long way, but he walked quickly, or he turned his face to the sanctuary and bowed, even if he didn't tarry, so he turned around, bowed, but got in his way, he's liable for karet. All of those things are considered staying more than he should. If he acted unknowingly, then he must bring a sacrifice. And as if he did it inadvertently, then it's still liable, but not for karet, but for the korban. 23. If he did not turn his face towards the sanctuary, but bowed as he was departing towards the outside area, then he's not liable unless he tarries, unless he stops and slows down, right? But if he bows as he's leaving, that's okay, as long as it doesn't, he's keeping his path along the shortest route out. How long a delay creates a liability? Right, what's considered delay? So he says enough time to read the following verse. Vayichru apayim arza ala ritzba v'yishtachavu v'hoides la'Hashem kitov ki lo eno chased. So if he stopped for as long as it takes to read that verse, the verse means, and they bowed with their faces to the ground on the floor, prostrating themselves and giving thanks to God who is good and his kindness is everlasting. This is a description that's brought down in the Divrei Hayamim. It's as long as that, which is, I don't know, how long does that take to read that? Maybe 20 to 30 seconds, maybe a little bit longer. That's it. Then it's considered that he's tarried and he would be liable for kares. And the final halacha for today, what is meant by departing via the longer way? So interesting, he's going to clarify over here. Any way for which it is possible to depart from the temple via a shorter way. Now, depending where he was standing, if there was, take the shortest possible route. If you take a longer route, intentionally, liable for kares. Unintentionally, you got to bring a korban. You got to find the shortest route. But here's something fascinating. If one departed by the shorter route, even if he did not run, in other words, he didn't get off quickly, but he's going the shortest route. He walked very slowly with intention, positioning his heel to toe, you know, although it takes the entire day, he's exempt. Interesting though, if he took a longer path, even though he ran and pressed himself with all his power, and thus the amount of time it took him to leave in this manner was less than if he had taken the shorter route, he's still liable because he departed via the longer path. Okay, interesting halacha. Now, if he departed by the shorter path, but walked some, then stood, tarried some, and continued this pattern until all of his delays together amount to the time that it takes to bow, he is not liable for lashes if he acted willfully, nor is he liable for sacrifice if he acted unknowingly, because there's an unresolved question concerning the matter. He is over against strikes for rebellious conduct. In other words, we said if he stopped for a defined amount of time, then he's liable. But what happens if he didn't stop at once for the defined amount of time, but he stopped a few times and altogether it's the defined amount of time? So he says this is something that's unresolved, so you can't punish him. He's not liable fully because it's a doubtful transgression, but he would get, as we saw it here, the lashes for rebellious conduct. Okay, let's do this quick test. A person afflicted with sarat may not enter Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the temple courtyard.
Jerusalem.
Right, well, it would be all right, but starting with Jerusalem. What is derived from the fact that Moshe took Joseph's bones with him? One, that one who contracts impurity through contact with a dead body is permitted to enter in Jerusalem. The one who contracts impurity through contact with a dead body is permitted to enter the Temple Mount. The one who contracts impurity through contact with a dead body is permitted to enter the sanctuary.
Number one. No.
He's certainly allowed to enter into Jerusalem. He's even allowed to enter into the Temple Mount. Right? Because that's where Machane Leviah, the camp of the Levite, which is where Moshe's home would have been, right? And 3, from what point is a non-Jew forbidden to proceed further into the temple area? They are not permitted on the Temple Mount at all. They are not permitted to enter further than the Soreg. They are not permitted to enter further than the Chel. The Chel, correct. Okay. Go. What is the punishment for one who willfully enters the temple while he is impure? Karet, death at the hand of heaven, lashes.
Right.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay, let's stop there. Okay, Shukach.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be back. And nice to see everyone. And yeah, I want to be there for you. Shukach.
We'll see
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.